welcome, welcome, welcome. We are on episode 2 of our week this week. We did our chat the other day with Juliana about virtual co-ops, which was pretty awesome. And now it's time for us to discuss book club. And I am just going to say that the other day I went in to type my notes. So Amanda and I kind of have a shared Google Doc where we dump our notes in there and stuff like that. And I went in there to print my document because I'm old and I like having a physical piece of paper in front of me. And I went in there to print it and I could feel Amanda rage typing into the document as I was looking at it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to have to wait to print this for a little while because this is going to go on for a while. All right. And I'm going to say it wasn't unjustified at all. Right? So to put it out there, right? Some of the books that we'll read in book club are ones that maybe Amanda's read and she's like, oh my gosh, this book is so amazing. We totally have to read this in book club, or vice versa. But some of them, neither one of us have read. I mean, that's what we do in our book club that we met through, where somebody just throws out a title and says, this looks good, or someone recommended it and we read it. And sometimes they're great. And sometimes we're like, meh, it was okay. Like, I'm glad I read it. I learned a few things, but it wasn't this life altering experience. So I don't remember if I've read this book before. I know, I was saying to Amanda the other day, I know when I made the decision to homeschool, I went to the public library. I took every single homeschooling book they had on the bookshelf off and brought them home and went through all of them. And in the beginning, I was going through them with a fine-tooth comb. And then as I kept going through them, I noticed the themes were repeating again and again and again. So then I started picking up and going through them faster. This might have been a book that I got at that time, but I got all of them that they had at the library. So none of them really stand out to me as far as the titles are concerned. So I don't think I've ever read this book before. And I'm just going to say that I read this and spent a bit of time going, what the fuck is he talking about? Like, what the hell is happening here? So I feel like before, usually we kind of have this like, what did you think? What were your high points, right? But I kind of feel like we have to address this elephant in the room. What do you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. Chapter 7 was not great, but it was okay. Chapter 8 was like, holy hell, I cannot believe this is still in a book that's published in 2024.
Right. And so we've talked about it in our previous sections that the book was originally written in 1981 and then was republished after, I don't remember the year. It was after the pandemic, though, because they talk about the pandemic a whole bunch in here. So 2021 was the republished, right? So, okay, let's give the 1981 author a little bit of credit and say, okay, he didn't know what he was. We've learned a lot. We've grown as a society. We've got medical advancements. We know better now. You'd think the 2021 guy, Pat Farenga, who did the updated and revised version, would have put a huge disclaimer on that section and said, this is out of date. We do not believe this. This is ableist. This is offensive. This is on all levels. Here's what we know now. Here's what the original author's thoughts were. But that's not the case here.
No, yeah, he sticks 2 paragraphs of his own in. I highlighted it later on. I'm sure I'll get to it when I talk about my thoughts. But yeah, I mean, 2 paragraphs that it's like there's some truth to it and some things to think about, but also still insanely offensive. What is happening?
Yeah. So to give you some background, if you're not reading along with us, which is totally fine, Chapter 8 is titled Learning Difficulties. And then the first section is called Disabilities versus Difficulties. And to summarize it, the main viewpoint of these authors, both of them in 1981 and 2021, is that learning disabilities aren't a real thing. They don't exist. That's
not neurologically, not a neurological issue. And if you just take your kid out of school, everything will be fine.
Yeah.
All right, we'll dive into that. Let's go back. Let's make sure we cover chapter 7.
Okay.
So, chapter 7, he up front says this probably could have been included in one of my previous chapters, but we're going to talk about it. And it's all about learning without teaching, right? Learning by doing. And I mean, there isn't much new here, right? Like the book has been talking about this a ton. for me, my happy takeaway, right, if I'm being optimistic, is that kids, just like adults, they're more happy to learn if they want to learn it and they remember things that they want to learn, right? We talked about this before. This is not new, and there are just more actual examples of this in this section of the book. I would say my less forgiving takeaway is that this author and I could never be friends. So even before we got to the train wreck that was chapter 8, I was already thinking, like, this author is so self-righteous, and so my way is the right way, and everything and everyone else is just stupid. Like on page 123, he says, what was it about even this very high-powered, child-centered, creative school that made children stupid? And
Yes.
I'm like, what the hell? Just because they don't think the way that you think, or because they aren't as out of the box thinkers as you think, like, you can walk up and call an entire school full of children stupid? Like, you have no business writing a how to make children better book. Like, you get to call people stupid. Like, just broad brushstrokes of, yo, you went to school, you're stupid. Like, what? Like,
Yeah.
no. I just, I don't. Yeah, I mean, it goes on to say it was being taught in the sense of being trained like circus animals to do tricks on demand, and that made them stupid. Like, holy, I just, yeah, I was like, yeah.
I feel like there is a thin thread of point that he's trying to make that actually does make sense there, right? Where, and we talk about testing in schools all the time, right? And how now, unfortunately, schools oftentimes teach to the test because their funding is based on the test results. And so what the kids truly learn is only what's on the test. And really what they learn is how to remember it long enough, how to regurgitate it, and then nothing, right?
Yeah.
So, but to say that every child who goes to school is stupid, that
was it, right?
It was a
like,
bit much.
We had seen throughout the whole book this thread of like, okay, I don't agree with the conclusion he's drawing, but I see the facts that he's talking about, or I see the reality that he's talking about, and I wouldn't draw that specific conclusion, but I see where he's getting it from. But like, this chapter just went that next step where I was like, what a jerk. Like, what are you? I don't. Oh, so I was probably admittedly not in the best mind frame to then move into chapter 8, but still on chapter 7. So something else that I didn't really like was on page 106. He makes this distinction about learning being what is forced in school, and finding out is what happens in real life. And I'm just like, why do we have to dumb down what learning in real life is? Can you not want to learn and acquire knowledge and accumulate knowledge and better yourself in that way without it having to be some colloquial, like, well, I found out how to bake a pie today? Like, what the hell is that?
I feel like it was like when Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow consciously uncoupled, right? It was like, right? Just, I'm like, really now? Really? It's kind of that thing, right? It's like, let's see how different we can be. I mean, I do think some of the word choices, like I made a notation there on that exact section. I highlighted the exact same section that you're talking about. And I did think, like, we do have an aspect of word choices mattering, because the word education has come to mean solely going to school. Or, and then even it's interesting, I'm in some groups where there's a heavy UK homeschool parent presence. And to them, homeschooling is not a preferred term, because I believe, if I understand correctly from following the conversations in the threads, homeschooling is if you're doing like public school at home online, and home educating is if you are truly doing what we know as homeschooling. And so it's interesting how kind of the words have these connotations that are associated with them, and it can really make or break a whole a whole discussion based upon the word that you choose. But yeah, finding out. I just feel like too, at some point we have to fit into the real world. So we are not the majority in most cases. Maybe there's some random place on earth where homeschoolers are the majority, which if there is, please send us a DM. I would love to move there. How cool would that be? But we are not the majority. And so when we write our transcripts or when our kids assimilate into a program or whatever, whether it's at college time or whether it's in high school and they're dual enrolling or whatever it might be, like you mentioned, your kid does programs through CTY and all that kind of stuff. The lingo they need to understand the lingo, because found out feels like I read it off the back of a cereal box kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, when you have those conversations with people that are like, well, your beliefs are nice, but they don't trump science. They don't trump facts. Like these kinds of things, they matter. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit rough. So, I mean, I did have some points that I agreed with in chapter 7, though. I will say that because people are like, why are we still listening to these two people trash a book? But I did have some points that I actually agreed with.
Okay.
For example, on page 98, about 2/3 of the way down, so there's this whole story about this child, this little child, who they get this kid a violin, and instead of formally educating her for the violin, they kind of just give her suggestions and show her through example and things like that. And at the end, it says, we were amazed how fast she learned to respect her instrument. And I was like, okay, great. And so it's funny because, like you were saying earlier, some of this stuff isn't new. It's not groundbreaking. We've read it in other books. We've read it in the beginning of this book. It's not groundbreaking, and yet it's still not the majority for so many people.
Yeah.
And so I have this kind of philosophy that I have trouble even putting into words. I think there's a thing from Spider-Man. I'm not a huge Marvel comic kind of person. So, but I think it's in Spider-Man where it's like, unto whom much is given, much is expected, or something like that. It comes from, I think it's a Peter Parker thing. And so I kind of have this thing that if you give kids this freedom and this empowerment and this trust, that they rise to the level of keeping it because they feel it and they love it. And it's not a carrot and stick thing. It's not a, you will lose this if. It's not even spoken. It's just a matter of they feel that sense of empowerment and then they kind of step up to that level in some way. And it's really hard for me to put into words, but I've seen it with my own kids that the more trust they have, the more freedom they have, the more they rise to that occasion. And the more I can trust them and the more freedom I can give them. And it's just been this really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship. So I did appreciate that line because I feel like in a lot of conversations that I'm involved in surrounding homeschooling, there's so much push and pull, and there's so much, just the kids are not empowered and they're not trusted and they're not treated in that same level of respect, that same pedestal that some might see. And so I liked that. I thought that was a pretty cool point because even though it sounds basic and a lot of people read it and they're like, that's common sense. It is, but it doesn't seem to be the predominant way of interacting with kids in our society.
Yeah. No, I feel you on that. Reading chapter 7, I definitely thought, a lot of times I was like, well, in our house, we walk this weird line of wanting to allow him to be a kid as long as he's a kid and not forcing him to grow up, but still giving independence and also speaking to him like he's an adult. I'm not going to dumb down my language. And if I use a word that he doesn't know, it's clear on his face, or he'll even ask what that is. And we will describe it, or we'll ask Alexa, or I might, depending on the situation, I might send him to the dictionary to look it up. But, I'm not talking down to him. And the book does really support this idea of, treating kids as if they're capable. That said, some of the stories, I was like, that doesn't sound like you're treating the kids like they're very capable. It's like, I felt like there was a little bit of mixed message there. And I don't know how much of that is the difference of how things were in the 70s when he was thinking about all of these things and starting the first draft of his book, versus how they are now, or if I just don't know how everyone else parents. I'm not sure. I don't know where the disconnect is.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That makes sense. It's one of those things where it's like a leftover of, it's a relic of children should be seen and not heard.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I feel like for us, weeding out that mentality entirely has yielded such incredible results. I mean, we have a family meeting tonight. It's a pretty big family meeting. There's a lot of big decisions on the table for discussion. The kids will be involved from start to finish. And they were given a heads up that the family meeting is coming so that they could bring ideas. And we're told, I mean, don't be ridiculous, right? But no ideas off the table. Whatever it is, put it out there. If an idea comes up that someone else has and it makes your tummy do a flip and you don't like it, or you're nervous about it, or you have questions about it, speak. It is a family meeting. Every single one of us in the meeting is able to share our thoughts, our questions, our concerns, etc. Because it's their life too. So yeah.
So I'm curious, in your notes that I can see, you have on page 101 about adults and ego. And I didn't mark anything on page 101. So I'm curious what you were thinking there.
So on the top of page 101, it says, perhaps the reason that so many adults, including I confess myself, find it hard to refrain from helping kids is that it wounds our egos to see how well they can get along without us. Okay. And I thought so it's funny because what did you say? You said he was self-righteous, right? So he's kind of just admitting, he's kind of just like, I mean, I'm so amazing. How could my kids ever thrive without me being involved in every step of their process? I don't think that that's it for me. I don't think I have an ego thing with my kids. I mean, I will say, when you come into my house, there's a huge sign that says caution, free range children. So I am pretty like, go for it. Give it a try. What's the worst that could happen? Right. I mean, within reason, nobody's playing with blowtorches or anything. Right. But generally speaking, they have freedom and they have this ability. But I think if ever there is a time where I do feel this like need to jump in and interject, it's not because of my ego. It's probably more because I like things to be done at a really high level of success, or it's something that I enjoy. And so I'm like, I want to be involved. And then I'm like, wait, I'm not helping them if I'm involved and they can do this. Let them do it on their own. So, but I don't usually find that I really sat and thought through like 20 scenarios that I could think of. It was like, yeah, I don't think this would be that. This would be this. This would be this. This would be that. But I'm like, I don't think any of them are ego. So I found that perspective to be really interesting.
Yeah, no, I can see what you're saying. We had a situation just yesterday that was one of those things, right? I can't remember exactly what the thing was, but he wanted to do something. And I said, well, I think, and I gave what I, would do. And he was like, I don't think so. I think it'll be fine my way. And I was like, okay. And he did it his way. And then he was like, I should have listened to you. That really didn't work out very well. But at least I learned the hard way, but I learned. I'm like, oh, you're right. And sometimes you have to learn the hard way. But life is full of those. And I don't think it's ego. It's just people who are like, well, I've been there. I've experienced that. And I'm happy to share with you how it went for me. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people are happy, like, oh, okay, I'm happy to learn from your experience and I don't need to experience that myself. And sometimes people are like, I don't think so. And then they experience them themselves and they're like, oh yeah, well, that happened to me too. Look. But yeah, I don't think it's ego so much. And I agree with you. I think it was an interesting word choice. Again, back to the words we choose and how much they matter.
Yeah. At least if he is in when you're reading, he's using self-righteousness and he's like, when he's writing, he's going, I have a bit of an ego issue. You're like, oh, okay, that kind of lines up there, right? I'm seeing where this is all coming together. Yeah. So yeah, I had that one. Until the only other thing that I had from chapter 7 was on page 110. There was a whole thing that I really thought was really cool. So it actually starts on page 109. And it was this instance where the Santa Fe Community College was starting a young inventor, and he invented a teaching machine, which was basically like a digital multiple choice test. So there'd be something on the screen, and the kids would push a button for A, B, C, or D, and it would light up red if it was wrong and green if it was right. So it was basically multiple choice, but it was done digitally in kind of the early days of computers. This is the 1981 section. So there you have it, right? And the kids did it for a couple of minutes, and they were like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then immediately the kids said, what's inside the box? Let's open it. Let's figure out how it works. And they wanted to know how it works, which I thought was super cool. Then they thought, well, let's make our own cards. And so they started making their own cards, and they developed this own little structure among themselves. Like, well, if you play my cards, I'll play your cards. And they started doing that. Then one kid made up a batch that was a joke batch where none of the answers were right, just to see the reaction that he would get from the other kids when it didn't work properly. And so it became this whole thing. And it reminded me of when my daughter went to school only for kindergarten and first grade. She's 15 now, so it's been a while. And we lived in Florida. The playground at the school was sand. And she came home from school one day, so excited. Mom, we invented this new game at school on the playground. And it's been many years. But as I recall, what it boils down to was they would make a giant mound of sand, and then they would run and jump in the giant mound of sand. But, there were rules involved as far as like if you land here and if you go this high and you go this far and all that kind of stuff. And they developed this beautiful structure around the game. Loved it. Came home, her shoes were full of sand, but loved it. So, day 2, played the game today, had so much fun, this, that, the other thing. By day 3 or day 4, she came home so upset. Not upset, like she wasn't crying or anything, but she was, shoulders slumped, tone in her voice had dropped, and we're not allowed to play the game anymore. I'm like, oh, why? What happened? Somebody's going to get hurt, so we're not allowed to play it. Like, you're jumping in sand. Who's going to freaking get hurt jumping in sand? I mean, it's just the most ridiculous thing ever. And so I thought, it's when that adult interference comes. These kids were cooperatively playing. They were using their imaginations. There was probably some element of math involved with like record keeping or point structure and whatever. And then some adult was like, somebody's going to get hurt. What's going to happen? You're going to land on sand the wrong way? I mean,
yeah. And the fact of the matter is, in another day or two, they would have gotten tired of it and made a new game.
Exactly. And not demoralize the kids in the process.
Yeah.
So it was just, when I read that, I was like, oh, I totally remember this. I mean, she was so excited about it. And, and then it got taken away. And I just thought, why? Why'd you have to do that? They were doing everything we want kids to do, and they took it away. They were probably tracking too much sand inside, is my guess, all these years on. Yeah. I mean, imagine like 10 of them, and they're traipsing it in. But I'm like, you're the ones who built a playground with sand on it.
Yeah, right.
They make that like rubberized mulch stuff. Put that then if you don't want sand in the classroom afterwards. But it happened. And you know what? I mean, and here's the perfect example. She's been home all these years. Today, she finished up at the farmer's market, and she was vending there, and she had to wait a couple of minutes for her ride home because we were going here, there, and everywhere and all this stuff. And she came home and she goes, I found a tree that's right by my spot at the farmer's market that I can get up into. And because of the way they trimmed the branches, there's like a spot where I can put my butt. And then there's a spot right nearby where there's like a footrest because it's kind of flattened out from the way they trimmed the branches. It's a 15-year-old kid. And she's still like, I climbed a tree, So having been removed from that environment where those things were always taken away, it's still there, which I love.
Yeah. I mean, my kid really enjoys imaginative play. And I am pretty sure that if he was in a traditional brick and mortar school, there would be a lot less of that by now, right? He's going into 5th grade. Imaginative play and creating entire worlds, not just in your head, but around you, is not cool in 5th grade, right? So the fact that he's here, he's allowed to continue that, and it feeds into all kinds of other interesting pursuits for him, right? He creates things. He's always building things from Legos, free building. And right now he's writing a story, which is huge for him and our story in our world. And, just all those kinds of things that he probably wouldn't be doing if he wasn't allowed to continue to indulge in imaginative play the way that he does. So, yeah.
I can only imagine the bullying that sweet little soul would be enduring if he was in that environment and trying to be himself.
He couldn't be, and we'd have to choose if that was okay or not. And we did choose, right? I did choose. I chose that it's not okay, and that's why he's home. But around a bunch of kids that are okay with it and can embrace who he is and his unique personality as he comes, right? That's what we all want. We all want a place where we can show up as ourselves, and people are like, okay, cool, I see you.
Exactly.
Okay, so I had a few more thoughts in this chapter. So from pages 111 to 115, it was full of examples where someone just wants to learn and they immerse themselves and they're super successful. And if they aren't successful, it's because of fear and anxiety and school learning and all of the bad things that they were taught in school. And I was like, okay, again, it's one of those things. To an extent, I agree. I'm terrible with languages. I cannot hear them, right? My husband speaks Cantonese, and I was able to learn some Mandarin, but then when I switched over to Cantonese, they have more tones in Cantonese, and I just can't hear the differences. If I can't hear the differences, I can't make the differences, right? Like, it's not about how much I want to immerse myself or how much I hear him speaking Cantonese with his family. Like, I just suck at learning languages, right? And we lived in a French-speaking country for 3 years, and I was the primary person in our family who had to take care of the legal things and do that. And I wanted to learn, and I was out, and I just, I learned enough to be able to get by, but I could have never had a conversation with someone, so for me, that was just like one of those examples of like, I don't think it's quite as easy as like, well, if you wanted to learn, you'd be super successful.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there are some things. Sometimes I think about it too with regard to, I see a lot of posts in Facebook groups about handwriting, especially as it relates to neurodivergent kids. And a lot of neurodivergent kids have fine motor challenges. It just is what it is. And there's all these posts about workbooks and pencil grips and this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, on the one hand, I get trying to improve it. I do understand that to an extent. On the other hand, no matter what it says in chapter 8, that is how their brain is wired. So it's very similar in my mind. I always kind of use this example, like, would you walk up to a blind person and be like, if you could just try a little harder to see, that would be amazing, right? Or like talk to a diabetic person and say like, your pancreas, have you tried yoga? Like it might help it might help your pancreas. It might just kick it right into gear. Essential oils maybe, right? And so it's like, it's not a matter of willing it to be. If the fine motor isn't there, it's really, really challenging. And so it's interesting because with one of my kids, we let that go and just went full digital with all of the writing and anything that needed to be done fine motor. With another kid, because of his goals, we discussed it and he said, yes, I would like to pursue, trying to figure this out a little bit. Will it be amazing? Probably not. But will he make improvements? Yeah. Probably a bit, but I feel like sometimes there's that like lack of acknowledgement of a person's limitations. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in this section where it's like, well, if you just try hard enough, try harder. One day you might really be able to see. It's like, no, I'm blind, right? That's not how that works.
Even further to your point, with the handwriting and the fine motor skills, for some kids, I know this because it's my kiddo, he has problems with handwriting, but it's not fine motor skills, right? He can draw amazingly. He passes all of the fine motor skill tests. It's actually a problem with the letters and handwriting, and it's in his brain. It's, it's that thing. It's not practice your finger grip then get a different, like it's, yeah, again, to your point, it's not just we'll cure that right out of you, but that's jumping ahead. So in chapter 7, they have a story about teaching kids to read, or rather not teaching kids to read. And if you just leave them to learn to read on their own, they'll become great, competent readers. Your kids, a few of them were probably in school, right? In a brick and mortar school when they learned to read. How did you handle reading in your house? I'm curious.
So it's interesting because I have 3 kids and they all learn to read completely differently. So kid number 1 went to a preschool in our town that was like the best preschool. And he went there, it was like Club Med of preschools. And I remember when he was 4 going into his pre-K teacher evaluation, and I didn't love his pre-K teacher. I loved the assistant, but the teacher was like a little bit much. I wasn't the only one either. So she sits me down and she's like, he's really struggling with the alphabet and this, that, and the other thing. And I was like, okay, well, like in relationship to the class, where is he? She's like, oh, he's like dead last in the class. And I'm thinking, oh, okay. So, we weren't homeschooling at the time. And I was living in this very competitive academic area, geographically speaking, where the schools are amazing and all the kids go to these amazing colleges and all this stuff. And so I got Letter Factory for him, the Leapfrog Letter Factory. I think I'll know that song until the day I die because we watched it so many times. And he learned his alphabet and things were good. And then he went to school. He went to kindergarten the next year. And all of a sudden, I get a sticky note home from school just saying, Aiden can start taking AR tests. And I was like, what is an AR test? I have no idea. So I asked another parent and we would read together at home. We did a little Letter Factory, whatever. And so I walked away from that experience thinking, I did good, taught the kid how to read. Life is good. Great. Let's move on. Then my daughter came along the following year and teaching her to read. I do not drink just by choice. I am shocked I made it through that experience without taking up drinking because we would lay in her bed at night with one of those god awful Bob books, and it would be the word the, and she'd be like, and I'm like, in my head thinking, oh my God, it's been the on the last 9 freaking pages that the word the was written. It's still the word the. Like, oh my gosh, I would walk out of her room at night like shaking. I was like, this child is never going to read. P.S. She can totally read, so it's fine. So then the interesting thing was when we decided to homeschool, my youngest came home after pre-K 3 at the school. I was working, and so I stopped working and I took them out of school. And I thought maybe I should just send him for like a year or two just so somebody else could teach him how to read. That felt really insurmountable to me because I hadn't done it from scratch. What I realized in teaching Astrid how to read was that I never taught Aiden how to read. Aiden taught himself how to read. And so I was like, oh, okay, that's why that felt so easy because I didn't actually do it. He did it. With her, we worked on it at home. And then with my youngest, I did what unschoolers do, and I waited for him to be ready. And I waited for signs that he was ready. So one summer we were on a road trip, and he said, the next time we go to the grocery store, because we were remote camping most of the time, the next time we go to the grocery store, can I have a notebook, please? I said, yeah, sure. What do you need a notebook for? I'd like to make words. And he would sit in the car and just make words. And he spelled them all out phonetically, how he thought they should be spelled. And so most of them weren't spelled properly, but he was making words. And then next thing I knew, we'd be traveling and doing stuff. And he started reading signs. And I was like, oh, the kid's reading signs. Look at that. And he just read, right? It just happened. And so it probably happened about a year later or a year and a half later than most people would feel comfortable with, but he just did it. And so, and still, I mean, he's 12 and he reads brilliantly. He's been reading since he's 7 or 8. But part of what I think slowed him down a little bit, to be honest, was I was sharing a story the other day about how I gave him audiobooks like mad because his insatiable need for content was more than I could really handle with 3 kids under the age of 4 at one point. So I started just giving him constant audiobooks to listen to. And he was reading 4th and 5th grade books when he was 4 years old. through audio. And then to sit down and read a Bob book or Biscuit Goes to School, he was like, why the heck would I want to read this? I'm reading The Count of Monte Cristo. He was like, why on earth would I want to read Biscuit Goes to School? And so I think that was also part of what kind of delayed him a little bit, was he couldn't read the level of interest and depth that he wanted. And so he was like, well, I'll just listen to stuff then. And so his reading came organically, and then it all leveled out and it was all fine. But it was interesting that all three of them learned in a completely different way.
For your youngest kiddo, that's a pretty Montessori style, to start with spelling words phonetically and not worry about whether or not they're getting them spelled correctly. And then once they are feeling confident in that, then to start looking at the actual rules and how you spell correctly. That's we experienced that when we did Montessori kindergarten. So for us, learning to read was, I have a few things on that, right? So I have said before, we did Montessori kindergarten. We hadn't done any kind of formal schooling or education kind of stuff before kindergarten. And we decided that the Montessori school was a great transition from just play-based learning at home into, you know, a little bit more structure, but still a lot of play. The one downside with that school was that he was one of the few new students coming in. That school, you start there at 18 months and can go up through third grade. So for him to come in at kindergarten, he was coming into a classroom of 5 to 7-year-olds. And he was considered kindergarten, but the system is not exactly the same at a Montessori school. And so they had a requirement that he be able to read to start kindergarten there, because he was going to be in a classroom full of older kids and kids who could read. And I was kind of like, oh, crap, we got to get on that. I will say that when I was in university, I had tutored kids who were struggling with reading and with math, both in the small rural town I was from and in inner city schools in Chicago, where I went to university. And I had learned at that time the basics of phonics. I did not know very much about phonics because I did not learn to read with phonics. But in tutoring, that was the thing. They wanted tutoring in phonics. And so we did super basic phonics instruction the summer before he was supposed to enter kindergarten. And he had his phonics down. You know, he could read the basic Bob books, but he wasn't reading anything else. And I was like, you know what? I am fine with that. Like, he's going to go into that classroom and there's going to be peer pressure. The other kids are going to be reading, and suddenly he's going to be like, oh, well, I want to learn how to read. And to some extent, that is how it happened. I would say beyond that, when the pandemic shut down the schools and he got sent home, I wanted him to get a little bit more and better reading instruction, but he was past what I knew about phonics at that point. And so I just signed him up for the Hooked on Phonics, like, online thing. They were, especially during the pandemic, they were running this promotion, like $1 for a month. And he only needed a month, but he did a month of this online game of phonics. And it was all of the, the compound letters that make up special sounds and things like that. And his teacher actually sent me a message like, he's made huge leaps in reading. What are you doing? I'm like, I signed him up for an online game. Sorry. Like, because Montessori is completely anti-computers, right? Like, that is not what they would have done.
Yeah.
But it worked. And, since then we went all the way through all of that reading. I'm a huge proponent of teaching phonics. I think, if you're going to teach reading, please teach phonics. It helps so much. Like, this idea of like teaching kids to memorize the shapes of words to learn what a word is like, it's ridiculous. And it is a thing. It's a thing. And it's happening. Like, public school teachers were taught that as part of their curriculum for how to do. And so now there's a big push now to try to get back to they call it the science of reading. There's actually a really great podcast on it. Maybe at some point we'll dive into that in our regular podcast. But the phonics works. And all of those crazy rules all of those crazy things that you're like, I have no idea why that word sounds that way. Like, for the most part, it can be explained in phonics if you actually learn all of the rules of phonics for the English language. And so I I'm a huge proponent of that. And we did do phonics instruction when he was ahead, because he had to be able to read to enter kindergarten, which is not normal, right? And so we finished it quite early, and he's a voracious reader. But yeah, we being the academic schoolers that we are, we did all about reading through level 4 and then moved on to other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you didn't just let him soak it up like a sponge and let him read cereal boxes
he got to
around the
read
house.
whatever he wanted, and we bought a ton of books. But there was a lot more structure around the fact that I wanted him to learn how to read, right? And part of that is my husband does not read, to the point that
Can we clarify that he can
read? He does not read for pleasure. Okay, there we go. It's one of those, like, maybe 1 or 2 books a year. And so, oh gosh, I don't know, probably 2nd or 3rd grade, our son started bringing him books of, like, this is an easy book to read and it was really good, right? Or this has really good history in it. Like, I think you should read this, Dad. And in fairness, my husband's like, I actually much more enjoy reading these, stories that are written like young adult history, or, like kind of period pieces, but they're not these big, thick, heavy things. But I think that, a huge part of that is English is not his first language. He moved to the United States when he was 10, and he got put in an ESL program where, he was taught to read, but he wasn't taught phonics and those kinds of things. Like, he just doesn't, it's not easy for him to actually just sit down and enjoy, just absorb it. And so for us, it's it kind of underpins this idea that, like, if you learn how to read, you can actually enjoy reading more, and the earlier you do it, the easier it is.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I could see that logic playing out then. Yeah, I like that. I thought of something while you were talking and it's gone, but that's what happens. Did I mention at the beginning that I've had a stressful week? Yeah. So the thoughts, they're coming and going at a pretty fast pace, apparently. All right, dare we dive into chapter 8?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. I mean, the basic concept, I don't even know how deep we have to go into this, except to say that it's completely ridiculous. The author, so first off, the one thing that I got was the use of quotation marks to kind of offset things. There was an episode of Friends years ago. Were you a Friends fan? So there's an episode, Joey is kind of among the friend group. Mm-hmm. He's the not so smart guy, right? That's kind of his shtick. And at one point, he discovers using air quotes as a tool of irony, but he does it completely incorrectly all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of part of the humor of that episode. And so there's a huge number of quotes that are used in this book when he's talking about disabilities being real, quote unquote, real or perceived and this and that. And it comes across as really kind of passive aggressive to me. Like, oh, like I can see his eyes rolling when he's like, these people with their real diagnoses. And I'm like, no, they actually are diagnoses.
Yeah, no. It's on page 126.
Go ahead, sorry.
I usually get angry insistences that learning disabilities are real, quotation. Yeah.
Quote unquote.
That is to say, built into the nervous system of children. Here are some of my reasons for thinking they are not. Like, mm-hmm.
Okay, I highlighted exactly what you just read, and then in the margin wrote, yeah, no. Literally just all I wrote. And then he goes on, and I'm reading the remainder of 126 and all of 127, and I literally wrote in the margin. Now, mind you, it's written in, this is a 1981 section. So he's talking about backwards reading. And I'm looking and I'm like, what on earth? And finally I wrote in the margin, I go, is he claiming dyslexia is not a real thing here? And that was my next note in the margin. And then I just thought, oh my gosh, he is. He's claiming that dyslexia is not a real thing. Just take your kid home from school, reduce their stress level, and apparently dyslexia goes away.
Yeah.
What on
Yeah,
earth?
and it doesn't matter. Like if they see the letters backwards, it doesn't matter because it's the same as when you draw a dog. A dog might be pointing one direction or it might be pointing the other direction, and letters are the same. And I was like, and he kept using P as the example. I'm like, that's not true. Then you've got a Q. It's lowercase. It's a P or it's a Q. It matters which direction it is.
Oh my goodness. I'm telling you. Now, I will admit, I mean, he does go on and on about how public schools are terrible for people with these. Now, in his mind, they're perceived learning differences.
Difficulties, yes. No,
Or
it's just
difficulties,
it's just
learning
a difficulty,
difficulties,
and you
yes.
need to let it go.
It's just, yeah, you're just having a rough day. Try harder. And so I will say, and we've talked about this in prior episodes, that I truly don't think the public school system has a clue what to do with neurodivergent kids most of the time. And so I will say, I do believe they are better off at home or in an environment where somebody has an inkling of understanding about neurodivergence. But I mean, a couple of pages later, he uses his air quotes again with perceptually handicapped. Like they just think that there's something challenging for them. No, it's not. It's not like that. It's just change your mindset. Maybe meditate a bit and dyslexia will go away.
I have also mentioned previously in other episodes that I am disabled. And, it's one of those things that's been the case for a long time. And we live in a super ableist society. So it took me many years to get to the point where I could say that, right? It was always like, well, what do you do? Like, oh, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom, or, these kinds of things. Like, and I am a stay-at-home mom and I love doing that. But the reality is I'm disabled and I couldn't hold down a full-time job if I had to. Like, it just couldn't happen. On page 128, he tells this story about how he worked next to what was supposed to be one of the best schools for learning disabilities, and the kids there were never cured. So clearly, like, they weren't disabled. And I'm like, what the fuck kind of ableist BS is that? Like, you're not disabled to be cured. You're freaking disabled. Like, end of story. And yes, I mean, you want, if you have a disability, you might treat it, right? You might find things that can help. You might put systems in place that help limit its negative impact on your life, or things that improve your quality of life or your ability to be in the normal world. But you're sure as shit not actually curing it. Like, I was so, yeah, that was when I was really rage typing, right? What?
I felt it from across the country. I was like, Amanda's on fire. And I get it because I had read the same I had just read it. And I was like, what is wrong with these people? Holy cow. Like, what is wrong with these people? It was unbelievable. So it was interesting. I made a note, and this is kind of a frivolous parallel, but it's something that was on my mind. So I don't know. Have you ever watched, I know you're not a huge TV watcher, but The Queen Charlotte,
yes.
It's like a Bridgerton spinoff on Netflix.
I think you were the one that recommended it, and like I had to watch it, and I was really happy about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Look at me. So one of the things that I thought when I was watching that, so it's about the quote, I will use air quotes, the Mad King George, which is what they called him, right? The Mad King George and his difficulties if John Holt was writing the story. But, and I have Googled a couple of times, like, what would his diagnosis be in today's world? Was it bipolar? Was it schizophrenia? Was it this? Was it that? And it's all conjecture because none of the people who are guessing it have lab results or imaging or have personally examined him or discussed things with him. So it's all conjecture. But at the end of the day, there was, I would say, a component of mental illness as we would now know it today. And some of the ways that they quote unquote treated him in the show, and we know this historically, that people with mental illness throughout history were treated with barbaric treatments and things like that, right? And I have this thought process that 200 years from now, because that's the time frame, right, between now and when King George was reigning, 200 years from now, people are going to look at the way we today in 2024 have treated our neurodivergent citizens, friends, relatives, loved ones, and look at it with the same level of horror that we watch them treating King George, because we know so little about neurodivergence, and they are made to feel less than, they are made to feel other, they are made to feel stupid, they are made to feel all of these things. And I truly think that we'll look back on it and go, I cannot believe how barbaric that they treated dyslexic thinkers who have so many incredible talents, right? Their ability, photographic memory, their ability to think in 3D shapes and things like that. From if you could leverage those things, and instead of harping on the fact that reading is quote unquote difficult in many cases and other things might be difficult, okay, these are people who would be amazing engineers, who would be amazing this, amazing that, something where that way of thinking can be leveraged and can be utilized and can be maximized. But instead, at such an early age, they're being pulled out, they're being made to feel other, they're being made to feel less than because of the things that they lack in a system that is made for a one size fits all kid. And it's just so, so tragic. And so when I read this, I just thought, oh my goodness, like how, imagine you're a parent who's just gotten a neurodivergence diagnosis and you're reading this and you don't have the foundation that we've built over years of parenting these awesome kids and reading so much and talking to experts and studying research and all of that. And you're thinking, oh, my kid just needs to try harder.
Right.
How damaging.
I mean, it's so bad. And that's part of the struggle, maybe problem with public school, right? Sometimes you do get useful services there, right? And some schools are amazing, or some special ed teams are amazing. And I have gotten some useful suggestions and helpful ideas from special ed instructors and directors and things like that to use in our own home. And I know in my extended family that they get a lot of services and have had some great success and luck with that, right? But an example like dyslexia, you're totally right. How much time do they spend trying to force the kid to be able to read the right way instead of utilizing all of the technology we have to allow them to access the information in an appropriate way and to output information in a way that other people can understand, and then focus on the things that they're good at using all of this technology that we have at our fingertips. And it's like, oh, well, but they're in a regular classroom, so they can't have all of the text read out loud to them, and they can't dictate all of their work into, speech to text software. Why not? Clearly you're doing something wrong. That's what they need. And if you're supposed to give them a free, fair, affordable education, like, how about you figure that out instead of spending all of your time trying to force this other way of doing it when their brain is not wired that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it goes back to, if they had a blind student, would they be pulling them out and encouraging them to see better? Right? If you just try something new, it might start to come together a little bit for you. Like, that's not.
Let's visualize how you're going to see.
It is.
I think that will help.
Exactly. Go back to your California I can statements, right?
Yeah.
I can imagine myself learning to see. Oh my gosh. The other thing that I would love to touch on as a parent of an ADHD child, actually all three of my kids have ADHD, but there's a piece in here on 136 about medications. Well. and I understand part of what he's saying, and then part of it is because I'm sure he thinks ADHD is just a completely made up thing, and this, that, the other thing, right? Like, oh, have you tried not giving them red food dye? Yes, of course we've tried that. You know what I mean? Like, move on from the red food dye. We've tried everything. Okay. But what's really interesting is it talks about medication use. And it says, while the global prevalence of ADHD has remained stable for the last 3 decades, an increase of 26% was seen in ADHD diagnoses in U.S. children 5 to 11 between 2007 and 2016, with an increase of 123% during the same period of U.S. adults. So that, I do think, is a valid thing to look at. Like, why are our statistics of ADHD so much higher than the rest of the world? And As somebody, I have one child who takes ADHD medication, and when I tell you, it has been life changing, like absolutely life changing for this child. And he's never been to school. So guess what, John Holt? It had nothing to do with him being anxious from being in school. But it has been life changing. We had reached a point where I didn't even know what to do anymore when we finally decided to go that route. It is impossible to get his meds every month. I mean, what I have to do to hunt them down because they're on back order, they're on national back orders, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's because of this increase. But in my mind, if the numbers are not lining up with what's going on all around the world, what are we doing in the US that's different, right? And there are a few components, right? So I do believe that diet plays a role in some of our things, right? And we have one of the most toxic food sources of any developed nation in the world, right? Things that are allowed into our food source are not allowed anywhere else. And our government is just like, sure, no problem, toss it in there. So that's an issue. And then the other thing is, we are asking kindergartners, 5-year-olds, to sit at a desk for 6 hours and do workbook pages and sit still and be quiet. And their bodies weren't meant to do that. It's not age appropriate. It's not developmentally appropriate. And other countries aren't necessarily doing that to their 5-year-olds. And so part of it, I do agree, comes from the source of public school. Well, the kid can't sit still in school, so there's something wrong with the kid. No, there's something wrong with the school. There's something wrong with the environment that your child's into. But that's not to say ADHD doesn't exist and that medications aren't necessary. It's just maybe we aren't necessarily looking at the full picture all the time when it's being diagnosed.
No, I totally agree with you. I have that same passage in my notes. I think what you read out was actually the kind of wrap up paragraph that Pat Farenga put in after all of John Holt's ridiculousness. And it's that same thing, like, look, I do agree that medication should not be the first line of defense for an ADHD diagnosis. I do agree that it is questionable why so many more boys are diagnosed when they first enter school. Again, to what you were saying, we're asking things of them that are not age appropriate, and we continue to cut recess and, movement breaks and all of these kinds of things. And that's particularly challenging, generally speaking, right? These are a lot of broad stereotypes, but for boys. And so, we have work to do there, but that does not change the fact that ADHD is a real thing. And I mean, you are by far not the only family I know who medication made a huge difference in their family for their child when they were diagnosed and they found the right medication and the right dosage. And it's become such a division in the US, especially because you get it from both sides. And, well, in France, they don't have ADHD. Of course they do. They're just not diagnosing it, and because the stigma is there, just like it's here in some places. And, well, I would never medicate my child. Like, well, maybe you wouldn't. I have a friend who is divorced, and there's a child in that mix that really needed medication, and the other parent wouldn't get on board with it, and he ended up getting kicked out of school. He was in several schools before he finally ended up in that one public school that takes all the kids that no other school will take, because he just got kicked out over and over and over. And it was just that thing of like, that didn't have to be his story. Like, from the very beginning, when they said, hey, he's got pretty significant ADHD, and this medication can help him learn and help him, get more out of life. Like, don't be, I'm never going to medicate my kid. I'd rather see him flunk out of school and, like, be considered a bad kid and then tell himself he's a bad kid. And then all of these, he's not, but the story that he's told becomes a story he tells himself. And the chances of him pulling himself out of that as an adult, once he's out of this system, it's like, come on. And, even a step beyond that, I have several girlfriends, you may as well, who are frankly quite bitter that they have only recently gotten an ADHD diagnosis because they look back at their childhood and their teen years and think, my God, if someone had just said, look, you have ADHD and it causes this, this, and this, and here are some strategies that you could put in place. Here are some different things you could try. They think, my life could have been so much easier. Even if the strategies didn't work, at least I would have known why I was this way. And,
Right. Why I
yeah,
felt like I don't fit in.
Thank goodness that we're letting adults get these answers, right? It is never too late to learn more about yourself, to better understand who you are and where your actions and reactions come from. Like, this is not a bad thing. And you're writing about it in this book like it's a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing, right?
Not at all. I mean, there's a comedian who I love, 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 and my 12-year-old and I have watched her comedy over and over again. Go ahead, when you watch it, go ahead and judge me for it. I don't really care. We enjoy comedy in our house, and it's like one of our connection points, and it's not always appropriate what we watch, but I don't really care. And so there's a comedian, Hannah Gadsby. She's from Tasmania in Australia, who was diagnosed as an adult autistic, and talks about this scenario when she was in school where she was truly invested in this lesson about prepositions, but she was just on a different wavelength than everyone else because her brain operates differently than everyone else. And she's asking questions, she's really engaged, she's interested, she's trying to figure it all out, she's puzzling it out, she's asking questions, and the teacher just finally gets so annoyed and kicks her out of class. And she says, that was not the last time that I got kicked out of class for reasons I had no idea why. Like, I had no idea why I got kicked out of class. I was genuinely wanting to learn about prepositions, but she was just on such a different wavelength, and the teacher wasn't on her wavelength. I was just getting so frustrated, And so she's like, having these answers and knowing why I'm on a different wavelength than everyone else has been so empowering for me. And it's really fantastic. There's a lot of talk about neurodivergence in her comedy special on Netflix called Douglas. It is absolutely amazing on every possible level. I love that show. But yeah, having those answers is huge. I myself would love to get diagnosed because as I've gone through this path with my kids, there's quite a few diagnoses that I've realized that I've missed along the way because girls are tremendously underdiagnosed.
So much so because it looks different.
Right?
It looks different. And also they are raised and conditioned to mask. And so they mask it so much better.
Exactly.
I have a good friend who, it was a hard road for them because they were saying, like, our daughter, she's amazing, but there's something going on there. And, the school goes, no, everything is fine. No. And finally they got that diagnosis, but they really had to push so hard for it because even now, if you are not educated on it and you don't know that it can look different, it often does look different for girls and women. I could go on and on, right? As a disabled person, I could go on and on about the importance and need for self-advocating in our medical system. But yeah, it looks different. It's so hard, but so valuable to actually know, right? Knowledge is power, whether it's health knowledge about learning disabilities, mental health things, or picking up a book and reading and learning that kind of stuff. Like, knowledge is power, full stop.
Or picking up this book and being like, you're freaking crazy. Shut up. Right? Like, but what is wrong with you?
And John Holt comes up all the time. There are true believers and people who really idolize John Holt and what he did for homeschooling. And I feel like it is so important to understand this book and where he's coming from, because if you don't know this, you can't have a conversation with those people and find out for sure where they're at and maybe help them see that there's a little bit more out there, right? If you are truly just homeschooling in the John Holt way, you may be missing some things that your kids really need. And hopefully that's just a matter of not realizing that there's like the next level of resources, right? John Holt, he was revolutionary in what he was doing for homeschooling and thinking about kids as independent individuals who should be valued, right? This was pretty new wave thinking in the 60s and 70s when he was putting this together, right? Book publishing doesn't happen quickly. The book was published in 1981. He wasn't thinking about this for the first time in 1981. So, there's nothing wrong with taking things from that and from appreciating what he did for homeschooling. There is something wrong with refusing to acknowledge all of the new data that we have in the last 5 decades.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would have put, like in the pharmaceutical world, they have those black box warnings on certain drugs that say like, dangerous, that needed to be on the beginning of 8, read this as an antiquated work of fiction. But no, instead you get all the way through it thinking, what the hell? And then at the very end, he's like, and I agree. Check. I was like, oh my gosh, what just happened to me? I'm having an out-of-body book experience.
And that was it. The last note that I made about this chapter was that they end it with 2 stories about a learning difficulty that involves mixing up right and left and east and west. And I'm like, first off, like, are those even real things? Like, I mean, I won't pretend to know everything about every learning disability, right? We have a few specific diagnoses that I've spent a lot of time reading up on and learning about. So it's possible that there's a learning disability where not like issues with right and left and east and west are like big predominant problems, maybe. I mean, but I don't know. It doesn't seem necessarily true, but it felt to me like it was like this one last, like, let me throw out these 2 ridiculous things so I can just really trivialize the whole idea of learning disabilities, right? She's just sitting here laughing. She can't even talk. She's just
I can't. Yeah, sorry. I forget that people are listening just on audio. I can't. I did not make a single note or highlight from page 137 on. And I think that's to your point that I was literally just sitting there reading it going, what the hell is he talking about? Like, what on earth? Why are you rambling? Right?
It felt like one of those family get-togethers where the crazy old uncle goes on and on about something that you're like, that doesn't. Okay, sure.
I live in South Carolina, and there's a whole bunch of people that think that Disney World is moving to South Carolina because of issues with the governor of Florida. And I'm like, I literally just stand there and nod. And I'm like, like specifically to this little tiny island that's a barrier island off the coast of Charleston that has traffic flow issues with like the handful of houses that are on it. And I'm like, you genuinely think that they're moving Disney World? Like, okay, great. Like I can't even engage. I just go, that's going to be great. I'm super excited. State resident pass, sign me up. Right. I can't even, it's like that level of crazy, Like,
yeah.
I can't. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, our next section of reading will be chapters 9 and 10. And here's hoping it gets back on the rails. 9 is
children and work. That'll be interesting. And 10 is homeschooling in America. So, I mean, maybe it's like a retrospective. That'll be interesting to look at and see.
We'll see. The one thing I can promise you, okay? The one thing I can promise you is our next book club selection is called Normal Sucks by Jonathan Mooney. I have read the book already. It's amazing. And the author of the book, I know, is dyslexic. I'm not sure. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'm looking at my bookshelf really quick to see. I actually have 2 copies of the book because I lost one and purchased it again and then found it. So now I have 2. That's how that
works, isn't it? Always.
Yeah, it's under something, so I can't grab it. But the really interesting thing is a foil to chapter 8 is that it'll be amazing because the author of that book, Jonathan Mooney, had the experience of being raised in a system where no one understood or acknowledged dyslexia. and so was made to feel all of these things about himself and his progress and his learning and his ability to learn. Of course, later to realize he's severely dyslexic. And P.S. spoiler alert, has graduated from Brown.
Clearly,
so
it was
having those tools
he needed to try harder, and the fact that he didn't, he's a failure, and he wasn't cured, and there you have it, right?
Oh my gosh! So at least I can guarantee you there's no ableism in the next book. It's going to be amazing.
I'm looking forward to it. It'll be a good palate cleanser.
Right? Oh my gosh! I swear. All right, everyone. Well, if you're reading along, 9 and 10 are up next. If you're not reading along, you saved yourself a lot of stress and aggravation in chapter 8. Just be thrilled you didn't read chapter 8. And we're here to tell you it was super screwed up, and don't ever feel the need to read it. So enjoy, and we will talk to you all next week. Have an awesome rest of your day.